This is FIORE'S Frontier, a Not Alone Origins story, written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by James Patrick Cronin. The Call. The invitation came at short notice, but let's be honest, when an invitation comes from Timo Fiore, you're going to accept it at no notice. I've spent most of the journey poring over what little video footage there is of the guy talking, and that was after it took all of 5 minutes to read the only 2 official interviews he's ever given. Timo is one of the richest men in the world, and he's also one of the most private, and that's what makes this opportunity doubly exciting. I'm on the last leg of the flight now after a smooth ride from New York to Frankfurt. Timo's people offered me use of his private jet, but here I am flying commercial, all so I can get there a day earlier than if I'd waited for the jet. I've waited a lifetime for an opportunity like this. One more day was too much to ask. Most of you won't know who I am, and you'll be reading this because of Timo, and that's cool. He's the draw. The draw. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm just the lucky guy who gets to chill in a lakeside villa for a few days while I take some notes on everyone's favorite mystery man. I say favorite. That's why his people want this, I think, to improve his image. It's not that people have any especially bad view of Timo, but he is verging towards the faceless billionaire territory that it gets harder and harder to escape from the longer they stay in the shadows. I like what I see in the short video clips of Timo. He stops to talk to people who recognize him in the street, even when he doesn't know someone is filming, and he always looks like he's being cool with his drivers and minders. He seems pretty damn cool in all regards, with that flowing Italian hair and those sharp-ass suits, but I'm hoping to get to the bottom of what his life is like behind closed doors. If this was a movie, I'd find a bat cave under the lake house. But right now, I'll settle for finding some backstory and personality. A driver does meet me at the airport in Italy with my name handwritten on a board, like in all the movies where that happens, and he introduces himself as Christoph. He tells me he's been with Timo for many years and that this is the first time Timo has invited a stranger to the lake house. "How many years have you been here?" I ask. "Since back when his folks were still around?" Christoph goes so quiet so quickly, I might as well have asked how many bodies they've buried. "I'll leave the answers for Mr. Fiore," he says after more than a few seconds of oppressive silence. "I didn't mean to—" "As I said," he interrupts, "it's not my place nor my desire to answer your questions." All at once I get the impression that Christoph doesn't want me here, and also that the parental question is a sore one. They were both colossally rich in their own rights, both inheriting a fortune and passing the combined mega-fortune onto their only child, and by all accounts, they were almost as private as Timo is. My question wasn't really about Timo's folks, so much as I was using their deaths 2 years ago as a reference point for small talk with the driver. But now I feel like there's maybe something there I should look into. After all, I did come here for backstory. Lake life. The drive doesn't take long. I'm glad about that, partly because Christoph didn't say a word after my innocent question, but mainly for how desperate I've been to get here since the invitation came in. Here is Timo's house by Lake Maggiore, or as I'm going to call it, Paradise. This place is lakeside in the same way that sand is beachside. It could not be any closer. Multi-billionaires often live in penthouses in London, New York, Moscow. But let me tell you, Timo has it right. I know he has a much bigger house a few miles away and that this place in Ispra is mainly for summertime weekends, but what a place it is. And here I am on a summertime weekend, right on time. I sit and wait, sit and wait, sit and wait. Eventually, Christoph gets out to open my door. I'm not exactly used to this, and it's not like I couldn't open it myself, but I don't want to barge out. Timo isn't anywhere to be seen yet, and I only know how great the view is from the winding drive that brought us in from the main road. Then, cutting the figure of a movie star against this perfect Italian backdrop, Timo steps out from the lake house and saunters towards us. "Mr. Carr," he beams at me, either faking excitement like a really good movie star, or maybe actually excited to see me. I couldn't guess why, but then I can't really guess why he chose me for this gig in the first place. In the phone call from his assistant, she said he liked my internet show and that I was his first pick for an interview. I asked whose idea the interview was in the first place, and she hesitated for a while before eventually admitting it was hers and that he took some convincing. My theory is that I'm just enough of an up-and-coming media name to be a plausible choice, but even then, it's a real stretch, while being pretty much the opposite of an investigative heavyweight. You guys know that. You've either never heard of me or you know what I usually do, and either way, you'll be as surprised as I am by Timo's choice. On my regular episodes of What's True, Man, I go to weird places to see weird things. I don't go to Italy to Timo Fiore. But hey, only an idiot looks a gift horse in the mouth. You can call me Truman, I tell him, shaking his hand and smiling back at him. This is surreal, but all I can do is roll with it. Mr. Carr is my father. At my side, Christoph shoots me an evil look. I didn't even mean it, but I've breached the topic of parents again. My father was a good man, and I wear his name with pride, Timo replies. But my friends usually call me Timo. I nod. My friends usually let me drive their cars and play with their jet skis. It takes a second, one of the most uncomfortable I can remember, but when the humor gets through, Timo pats his stomach with an open hand and laughs heartily. He turns to Christoph. What did I tell you? Truman here was the best choice. Christoph is far from convinced, and he's clearly comfortable enough with Timo that he doesn't have to fake agreement. Will you need anything else this evening, Timo? He asks. I read a lot from how they interact with each other here. Christoph is totally at home, and he uses Timo's first name, and Timo's tone is that of someone talking to an equal. There's a lot to unpack here because, on the face of it, people don't come a lot more privileged than a guy who was born into the sole inheritance of 2 European dynasties, but he just seems like a good guy. Just a tall, handsome, impeccably dressed, richer than royalty guy. Jealous? Me? The outside of the lake house was a real picture, but inside is something else altogether. You know when you see a music video, or a travel brochure, or a commercial for an investment fund and you think no one actually lives in a place like that? Well, I found the guy. I hope you didn't clean the place up like this just for me, I say. Timo chuckles again. I don't know if he's used to everyone around him being super serious. That'd make sense with how much money is involved in everything he does, but so far he seems like the best crowd in the world for my stupid lines. If he chose me on the back of my web show, I guess that makes sense. We keep it nice, he says, and by we, I owe your compliments to the cleaning staff. They're here much more often than my own place in Varese. My mother loved it here. Serene, you know. He's begging me to ask about them. With Christoph gone, there's nothing holding me back apart from my own instinct not to. This isn't an interrogation. I want to get to know the guy, and he's probably going to be more on guard for the first little while. I love it here already, I tell him, slowly wandering through the living area and towards the alluring lake that lies beyond. I got a glance of the kitchen with its glass and metallic surfaces, designed in perfect contrast to this cozy area. There's a couch and a nice TV, but the exposed brick walls give a rustic feel, even before you take in the unusual combination of wood-paneled ceiling and irregularly tiled floor. I suppose the door should always come first. He smiles, but it's a kind of knowing smile that seems to suggest he knows I'm holding back my questions on purpose. I forget all about those questions when I step outside, though, into the most picturesque vista I've ever seen. What time is sunset? I ask. To be honest, the question asks itself. He tells me 3 hours, and that he'll be sure to have some dinner brought in at the right time. There are no staff on site, he says, to give us full privacy, but naturally I can't come to Italy without having what he proudly promises will be the best pizza of my life. I like the sound of that, but can still hardly focus on anything except the clarity and stillness of the water as it flickers in the sunlight. It's like I'm getting the life of a travel writer and an interviewer all wrapped into one here. Not bad for a kid from the Bronx. And if you can stay up for a few hours after that, we will get an unbeatable sighting of Saturn's rings, Timo promises. Tomorrow night might work, but some cloud is forecast. Are you feeling any jet lag? Nothing worth missing a chance like that, I answer. Are you big into space and stuff like that? Do you have a telescope? He looks confused for a second, like I've asked something really obvious, but a warm smile follows. Space holds the answer to more questions than we could ever think to ask, my friend. As for telescopes, I have the biggest one in the world, and within a decade, I'm going to put a much bigger one in orbit. This is all news to me, and the last part sounds like something I would know about if it was public knowledge. You're planning to launch stuff into space? Of course I am, Truman, he says, leading me back inside and taking a seat on the couch where it seems like our interview is about to begin. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be cheap. But why else do you think I sold my parents' businesses? #goals. I saw your What's True Man episode about aliens, Timo says, speaking from the ultra-modern kitchen as he fetches me a drink. How's that for a sentence I never thought I'd write? I cringe a little. That wasn't my best show by any stretch, and the ratings would tell you it's one of my worst. I went to a gathering in the woods with a bunch of spiritualists who thought either they were talking to aliens or were pushing the limits to see how much I would fall for. Needless to say, I don't promote that one. Those people were batshit crazy, Timo says. At this, I relax. I was worrying for a second that we might be going for some weird lakeside experience after sundown. But you gave them a fair hearing, he goes on. You didn't call them batshit crazy, and you didn't even let your expression say it. You're straight down the line, as objective as you can be. I know you're not a serious reporter, by your own description, but that's more than I can say for most of the serious reporters out there. You're more interested in documenting interesting subjects than putting your own spin on it. I like that. This is nice to hear, especially from someone like Timo, and it's beginning to explain why he wanted me here. He brings me a small glass of red wine and tells me to taste it. His glass is full of water and it's only 4 o'clock, but I'm pretty much in Rome, and you know what they say about that. I'm not a wine guy, but I don't need to lie when I tell him it's good. Local, he says. I picked up a vineyard that was at risk of going out of business. My driver, Christoph, his grandparents and his father ran it for decades. That's how far it goes back. It would have been a tragedy. We're trying to make it viable again, but in the meantime it's still churning out the good stuff. Like so much of what Timo says, it's tough to know where to start with this. He's not a businessman. That's the clearest thing in the world. He sold the car firm and fashion house as soon as he could, and this vineyard he's talking about clearly wasn't an investment. Even though he's very private, Timo strikes me as a real people person in a small-scale way. It's early to make that call, but his small mannerisms and comments point to him being someone who cares about people, but is understandably cut off from most of them thanks to the different reality he lives in. I don't think many people will be feeling sorry for him, but I think it has to be a lonely life when so few people can relate to you. Anyway, when Timo talks, he sounds like a regular guy. He doesn't sound all that Italian, which I'm guessing is because he spent most of his childhood at a boarding school in England, and the rest of it being raised by nannies. More than that, though, he doesn't sound rich. His focus with the vineyard was saving the jobs and saving the wine, not making money. It sounds like other people are more concerned about the commercial viability than he is, even when it's his money on the line. But that's the grand contradiction here, wrapped up in a neat ball. Timo seems like a regular guy, but he's not. Timo Fiore is a guy who can talk about picking up a failing vineyard in the way a regular guy picks up a cheap car. Contradictions make characters, and that's why I'm here. People ask about my childhood a lot, he muses, and I know it'll be on your list. I get the feeling this is going to be the easiest interview ever. We're getting along well, and now he's asking his own questions of himself. I'm going to sit back and let the answers flow. There's not a lot to say that isn't public knowledge, if I'm honest. I grew up in England more than anywhere else. You know, my mother was Swiss and my father was Italian, but I feel European more than any individual nationality. I haven't spent a lot of time in America, and the difference between our politics and economics and yours is beyond my understanding. You ever been to New York? I ask him. He nods. Nice place. Did you make it to the Bronx? Not yet, he replies. I ask if he enjoys traveling in general, or if he only really goes abroad when he has to. He ponders this for much longer than any other question. It doesn't look like he's seeking a politically correct answer, just the fullest and truest he can think of. I don't like traveling alone, he says. He looks at the space next to him on the couch. It's harder to tolerate than just living alone, amplifies it. For the first time, I'm stuck for what to say. I'm staring at a young Italian billionaire who wouldn't look out of place in a perfume commercial, and he seems to be lamenting his singledom. I can't not ask, so I do. You don't strike me as someone who has to be alone. Why no Mrs. Fiore? I can't lie, Truman, and I wouldn't, even if I could. I'm paranoid. If I could meet someone who didn't know who I was and wouldn't care once she found out, my prayers would be answered. And I'm loosening up now that I've sold the businesses, but until then I was just totally shut off from the idea. Losing 50% of everything is one thing, but losing 50% of my parents' family business was too much. Since I cashed out, at least it's just money instead of equity. Especially with Paldor, my father had very clear wishes. To say Timo giving me more than I bargained for would be the understatement of the year, but I think sometimes it's best to let words like these sit. A real reporter might drill down on his comments about the relationship and divorce paranoia, but maybe that's part of why he didn't ask for a real reporter. He's segueing perfectly onto his parents, so I'll let us move there. You mean when your father specified his wish that you'd sell the supercar firm to Italian buyers? I know you got a lot of flack for that. His eyebrows rise and fall. That's one way of putting it. I turned down a lot more money from Japan than I got from the Italian buyers, but his wishes were clear. I'm as much of an internationalist as you'll find, but that was in no way a racist request. He didn't say, don't sell it to the Arabs or anything like that. He just said, keep it in Italy. The lineage goes back to the start of the automotive era, and it's a straight line of continual family ownership from Italian father to Italian son. If I had a son, it would be his. I don't. So it moved sideways to another Italian. That's the beginning and the end of it. He sounds angry here for the first time, but not at me. I stay silent for a while in case he wants to continue, but he doesn't. And your mother's family business, Pierre and Jonas, she had no requests about where it ended up? Timo shakes his head very briskly. I don't know how much you know of my mother, but there was no national or family lineage to speak of with the fashion house. Her French mother inherited the company from her late husband, and her Italian father was in politics rather than business. Pierre and Jonas meant little to her beyond the revenue it provided, and even less to me. So, when the Qataris made their frankly insane bid, well, I took it. But Paldor was different. That was a family business born in Italy. The Japanese consortium didn't like it, but I'll defend that sale until the day I die. Were you closer to your father than to your mother? I ask. It's on the nose, but it feels like we're ready for that. They were a unit, he says, forcing a smile that looks more than a little forlorn. One followed the other by a few months, like it often goes when they're so close. They were so close. It was impossible for anyone else to be closer to one than the other. It's a nice answer, but doesn't give me much. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how close were you? Timo tips his head back and chuckles. 8.3. He grins, humoring me. But really fairly close. More than average, I would say. They sent me to England for my schooling because they were always moving around, and I think they wanted me to be somewhat grounded. I went to the best schools with other privileged children, for sure, but their backgrounds were at least more varied than if I'd been privately educated here. As a young child, I didn't understand why my parents didn't want me around, but I came to realize it was for my own good. I don't want to get any deeper than you're comfortable with, I tell him, sensing a change in his tone. He nods, and I appreciate that, Truman. I'm happy to talk about anything, but the reason I accepted my advisor's suggestion of doing this was to talk about space exploration. I have motive and I have means, and I'd like to talk about my goals. You gave those interesting characters in the woods a fair hearing, and your audience is exactly the kind of young crowd I want to get enthused about space. I'm 41. I missed the moon landing by a few years, and there's been nothing to come close ever since. You and I didn't have that, but I want the generation after yours to know that sense of wonder and of humanity pursuing new endeavors for the benefit of all. Like what? I ask him. Go to Mars? Truman, I'm an internationalist who rarely travels, he smiles. I don't want to go to Mars. I want to engage with extraterrestrials. Aiming high. The pizza that arrives just before sunset is the best I've ever had. Timo looks proud when I tell him that, but even prouder when he tells me that it came from 2 miles away and only cost €9. Pride is an emotion that's rarely off his face tonight, especially when the telescope comes out. It's smaller than I expected, given the funds at his disposal, but admittedly I don't know much about what I'm looking at. He talks me through it, but quickly realizes the merit of show don't tell. I adjust nicely to the growing darkness, which is surreal to my city-raised eyes. Stars become constellations, and I'm excited when he tells me that the brightest thing, besides the moon, is Venus. When he decides it's dark enough for the scope, it's Venus I want to see first. Too late, though, because he's already framing Saturn and telling me how lucky I am to have picked tonight to arrive. I don't interrupt by telling him that this is the night I was invited, and that I would have come a year ago if his people had made the call, but I'm intrigued to see what he means. A few seconds later, I'm staring at those perfect rings I've only ever seen in pictures. It's a humbling moment, probably the most awe-inspiring of my life, and the gasp I let out on first sight brings a warm chuckle from my guide. I can't believe a telescope this size can make such a difference, I say as I step away. The magnification is insane. He tells me a little bit about how it works, keeping it simple for my benefit, and then smiles the widest smile I've seen yet as he moves to the subject of the new radio telescope at his world-leading research observatory. The Cavalieri Observatory, as he tells me it's called, is already staffed by some of the best astronomers in the world and is attracting applications like never before thanks to the new scope. That telescope doesn't look like what I'm probably picturing, he says. It's not like a bigger version of the one in front of me, but more like an enormous satellite dish built into the ground. Timo positively beams as he tells me that it's significantly bigger than its groundbreaking forerunner at Arecibo in Puerto Rico, but takes pains to insist that it wasn't a competition. He just wanted the Cavalieri radio telescope to be as big as it can. Rumors that the Chinese are trying to make an even bigger one don't trouble him either, he insists. In his words, hell, I hope they make one twice the size. I hope they use some brand new tech my teams don't even know about, and I hope it keeps pushing our horizons and understandings further each day. One thing I've been noticing about Timo Fiore all day is that he talks like he means it. Specifically about this, for sure, but really about everything. He doesn't speak much in public, not often, and not with a lot of words when he does, but he has that rare air of someone who means every single thing he says. How much have you spent on the observatory at Cavalieri? I ask. Timo puffs out his cheeks and says he'd have to check. All he says for sure is that between that and the other sites he's improved or built from scratch, it's at least a few billion. My eyes almost fall out of my head. A few billion? With the costs of land, construction, equipment, staff, world-leading observation is a major undertaking. And even at that level, it's profitable? There's no popping out of heads, but this time Timo's eyes narrow so much that they almost disappear. What do you mean? The main telescope was crucial. If we didn't have it, my team would have to pay for time elsewhere, so I suppose there's some economic sense there. The market couldn't, or at least wouldn't, fund something like this, he says. There's no return. If we find something like a signal, it's not monetizable in the same way as striking oil or finding gold. Now, if we find a planet made of gold, we both laugh heartily. But really, he goes on, the VC firms are moving into asteroid mining and things like that. There's no money in radio observation, but money isn't what we're looking for. I funded Cavalieri because my astronomers needed more time on serious telescopes than they could get anywhere else. Everyone knows you can't buy time, but it turns out that you can buy telescope time. You know, by building a telescope they can use as often as they want. And your number one hope, I say, seeking an answer mainly to satisfy my own curiosity. Would that be finding another species we can talk to? Or maybe another planet we can live on? Which excites you more? Aliens, he says. We have a planet to live on. We have oceans to tame. We have orbital space to colonize. We have a moon and, yes, we even have the likes of Mars. What we don't have is access to a species with knowledge to help us utilize and improve what we already have. The realization that this affable billionaire looks set to dedicate the rest of his life to finding aliens is just about the last thing I expected to discover when I set out for Italy, but Timo's voice is filled with more conviction now than ever. He doesn't seem like a man who will rest until he succeeds, and maybe I'm not quite as selfless as him, but I'm hoping that when he succeeds in all of these plans, this little interview will stand as a meaningful first statement of his ambition. Where do you want to be in 10 years? I ask him flat out. There, he says, pointing to the sky. I want to be sitting in an orbital lab with telescopes far beyond anything we can build on Earth. I want to be pressing the launch button for a new probe, too. Something like Voyager that will bring people together again. We need beacons like that now more than ever, as bridges between our increasingly divided nations. It seems like national governments are no longer willing to invest in serious space research, much less cooperatively, so the door is open. And I can tell you with an honest heart that whether I walk through it or I spur them into action, it doesn't really matter. Truman, I just want to see what's on the other side. With that, Timo leans back in his chair and gazes up thoughtfully at the unending wonders overhead. It's been a long day, and I'm sure another one lies in wait, but my first evening with Timo Fiore has introduced me to a man who wants to do good with the money he was born into, and he's identified what he sees as the best way to do it. In just a few hours, I've gotten way more than I bargained for in terms of personal insights, and even more so with these plans for what could eventually turn into a private space program. I guess most of you, okay, all of you, didn't expect me to end up getting into all this talk about space and telescopes and orbital labs, but that's Timo in a nutshell. Unexpected. What I get from Timo is that he doesn't just want to make people's lives better. He wants to make life on Earth better. He wants to make the world itself better, and he thinks he knows just the way to do it. In his own words, Timo Fiore has means and he has motive. He wants to expand humanity's reach, and he's in a better place than almost anyone else to make it happen. He's talking on a scale of years and decades, but things are in place already. Whatever Timo shoots for, it's a braver man than me who will bet against him. Coming at you from Lake Maggiore, planet Earth, I've been Truman Carr. Thank you for listening to FIORE'S Frontier, a Not Alone Origins story. Written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by James Patrick Cronin, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Produced by Blue Nose Audio. Production coordination by Candace Lawrence. Post-production by Michael Straza. Copyright 2021 by Craig A. Falconer. All rights reserved.